The carriage door flew open before the wheels had fully stopped, and Alara Whitmore stepped down onto the gravel with her chin lifted, though her hands trembled inside her gloves. Rain hammered the stone steps of Thornfield Hall. Lightning cracked over the towers, and for one terrible second she saw him standing in the doorway, tall and still, his face half hidden by shadow and half marked by a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. This was the man she had been given to. This was the Duke the servants in her father's house called a monster behind closed doors, the man nobody dared to disobey. "You are late," he said. His voice was low, rough like stone dragged over stone. "The roads were flooded, Your Grace," Alara answered, refusing to look away from him, though every instinct told her to run back into the carriage and never come out again. "I did not choose to be late, just as I did not choose to be here at all." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He turned without another word and walked into the house, expecting her to follow like a dog on a lead. She did not move. "I will walk in when I am ready," she said to his back. He stopped. The silence stretched long enough that even the rain seemed to pause. Then slowly he turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "No one speaks to me that way in my own house," he said. "Then I suppose I am the first," Alara replied, and stepped past him through the door before he could answer. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them knew it yet. A marriage built from debt and desperation, a contract signed by her father to save their family from ruin, a duke who wanted nothing but silence and distance from his new bride. Alara had expected cruelty. She had prepared herself for it the entire journey north, rehearsing in her mind how she would endure whatever waited for her behind those gray stone walls. What she had not prepared for was a man who looked at her like she was a puzzle he could not solve, and could not walk away from either. The great hall of Thornfield swallowed sound the way a held breath swallows a scream. Alara stood in the entryway, water dripping from the hem of her traveling dress onto the marble floor, and studied the portraits that lined the walls. Generations of Ashworth dukes stared down at her with the same hard eyes as the man who had just vanished up the staircase without so much as offering her a room. A woman appeared from a side corridor, older, with gray hair pulled back tightly and a ring of keys at her waist. Her eyes swept over Alara with something that was not quite kindness and not quite suspicion. "You must be the new Duchess," the woman said. "I am Margaret Doyle, housekeeper of Thornfield. I will show you to your chambers." "Thank you," Alara said, "though it seems His Grace has already forgotten I exist." Margaret's mouth twitched, almost a smile quickly hidden. "His Grace forgets many things when it suits him. Come. You will want to change out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." As they climbed the staircase, Alara noticed things she would remember later, the dust on the unused wings, the way certain doors stayed firmly shut, the portrait near the top of the stairs that had been turned to face the wall instead of the room, as though someone could not bear to look at it. She wanted to ask about it, but something told her the question would not be welcome yet. Her chambers were in the east wing, far from what Margaret called the private apartments of the Duke. The room was handsome but cold, as though no one had lived in it, or laughed in it, or dreamed in it for a very long time. Alara sat on the edge of the bed after Margaret left and allowed herself, finally, one single moment of fear. Then she stood, unpacked her own trunk because no maid had been assigned to her yet, and decided that whatever Thornfield Hall wanted to make of her, she would not become smaller to fit it. Dinner that evening was a silent, formal affair in a dining room built for 40 guests and occupied by exactly 2. Gideon Ashworth sat at the head of a table so long that Alara had to raise her voice simply to be heard. He ate without speaking, without looking at her, as though she were another piece of furniture recently delivered to the house. "Is this how it will always be?" Alara finally asked, setting down her fork. "You do not speak, and I am meant to sit here pretending I am dining alone." "You may dine in your rooms if the arrangement displeases you," Gideon said, still not looking up. "It does displease me," Alara said. "Not because I mind silence. I have lived with plenty of it. It displeases me because you seem to think that if you say little enough, I will simply disappear and stop being a problem for you." Now he looked at her. His eyes were a dark, stormy gray, and there was something ancient and tired behind them, something that had nothing to do with his age. "You are not a problem, Duchess. You are an arrangement. There is a difference." "An arrangement can still be spoken to," Alara said. "Unless you have forgotten how." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and she wondered if she had gone too far, if he would rise from the table and have her sent back to her father in disgrace. Instead, something almost like amusement passed over his scarred face, so briefly she nearly missed it. "You have a sharp tongue for a woman who arrived here soaked to the bone and friendless," he said. "And you have a cold heart for a man who married a stranger to settle his own family's debts," Alara answered. "It seems we are both making the best of a poor situation." He did not answer that. He simply returned to his meal, but Alara noticed, or thought she noticed, that his shoulders had lost some of their rigid tension, if only for a moment. Over the following days, Alara began to explore Thornfield Hall the way a soldier studies unfamiliar terrain. She learned which servants would speak to her honestly, and which ones watched her with wary, guarded eyes, as though waiting to see whether she would last. She learned that the West Wing, the oldest part of the house, was kept locked, and that even Margaret grew quiet when Alara asked about it. She learned that Gideon left the house before dawn most mornings and did not return until well after dark, and that when he was home, he kept almost entirely to his study, as though the rest of the house belonged to someone else. She also learned, slowly in small pieces, that the servants of Thornfield were not treated as she had expected servants of a great house to be treated. A young maid named Clara mentioned, almost in passing, that wages had not been increased in years, though the estate clearly had money enough for grand portraits and imported wine. An old groundskeeper named Arthur limped badly from an old injury and continued working far past the age when he should have been allowed to rest, because Thornfield offered no pension to those who served it. It struck Alara as strange. A man cold enough to ignore his own wife did not seem, at first glance, like a man who would notice or care about the comfort of his staff. And yet something did not sit right. The house was well kept but joyless, efficient but empty, as though every decision made within its walls had been made out of duty rather than affection, including, she suspected, the decision to marry her. One rainy afternoon, unable to bear the silence of her own chambers any longer, Alara made her way toward the study where Gideon spent most of his hours. She had not been invited, but she had decided, somewhere between her second and third day at Thornfield, that she would not spend her marriage waiting for invitations that never came. She knocked once and entered before he could tell her not to. Gideon looked up from a stack of papers, startled, and for a brief instant, before he could arrange his face into its usual guarded stillness, she saw something raw there. Exhaustion, worry. The look of a man carrying a weight far heavier than anyone around him understood. "I did not summon you," he said, recovering quickly. "I did not wait to be summoned," Alara replied, stepping further into the room. Her eyes moved over the papers on his desk before he could gather them away, ledgers, columns of numbers, letters with official-looking seals. "You are worried about money. That is not your concern." "I am your wife," she said. "According to the contract my father signed, that makes it very much my concern." Gideon's jaw tightened. "The contract made you my wife in name. It did not make you my confidant." The words landed harder than she expected them to, though she kept her face steady. "Then perhaps you should have married a woman content to be nothing more than a name on a piece of paper," Alara said. "I am afraid you have gotten quite the wrong bride for that purpose." She turned to leave, refusing to let him see how much the exchange had cost her, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Alara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned back, startled. "The estate is in difficulty," he said quietly, as though the admission physically pained him. "My father left debts I am still working to clear. I did not marry you out of cruelty. I married you because your father's fortune, joined with what remains of mine, was the only way to save Thornfield and everyone who depends on it. I did not think it fair to burden you with the details of a mess that is not yours to carry. Alara studied him for a long moment. The anger in her chest softened just slightly, replaced by something more complicated. "You should have told me," she said. "I did not agree to be protected from the truth, Your Grace. I agreed to be your wife. If Thornfield is in trouble, then it is my trouble too, whether you wish it or not." He did not answer, but he did not tell her to leave again either. And when she finally did go, she felt, for the first time since arriving, that she had won something, though she could not yet say what. That night, unable to sleep, Alara wandered the long gallery above the great hall, where moonlight spilled through tall windows onto rows of silent portraits. She stopped in front of the painting that had been turned to face the wall, and, after a moment of hesitation, reached out and turned it around. It was a portrait of a young woman, beautiful, dark-haired, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Something about the frame suggested the painting was not very old, perhaps 10 or 15 years at most. Alara stood staring at it, wondering who this woman was and why her image had been hidden away like something shameful, when a voice behind her made her jump. "Turn it back." Gideon stood at the end of the gallery, his face unreadable in the dim light, though his voice carried something sharp and dangerous that she had not heard from him before. "Who is she?" Alara asked gently, ignoring the order in his tone. "That does not concern you." "Everything in this house seems to not concern me, and yet somehow it always does," Alara said. "Was she your mother?" Something in his expression cracked just slightly, like ice under too much weight. "She was my sister," he said finally, the words dragged out of him as though they cost him blood. "Now turn the painting back, Alara, please." The please undid her more than any command could have. She turned the portrait to face the wall again, and when she looked back at him, he was already gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor like a man fleeing something far more frightening than a locked door or an unpaid debt. Alara stood alone in the gallery for a long time afterward, staring at the blank back of the canvas, understanding for the first time that the coldness of Thornfield Hall was not the coldness of an empty house. It was the coldness of a house holding its breath around a wound that had never been allowed to heal, and she had just discovered, quite by accident, exactly where that wound lived. She did not sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in the moment before he asked her to turn the painting back, and the sound of the word please, so unlike the man who commanded rather than requested, stayed with her until dawn crept gray and quiet over the hills beyond Thornfield, promising a day that would test both of them in ways neither yet understood. The morning after the gallery brought a strange shift to the house, though Alara could not name it at first. Gideon appeared at breakfast, which he had not done since her arrival, and sat across from her instead of retreating immediately to his study. He said little, but he was present, and for a man who seemed to treat his own home like a place to be endured rather than lived in, his presence felt like a small offering. "I would like to see the estate," Alara said, buttering a piece of bread with more care than the task required, mostly to avoid looking at him directly. "If that is permitted." "You do not need my permission to walk the grounds," Gideon said. "I was not asking to walk the grounds," Alara replied. "I was asking to understand what I have married into. The tenant farms, the accounts, the people who depend on Thornfield. You said last night that the estate is in difficulty. I would like to see for myself what that means." Gideon set down his cup slowly, studying her the way a man studies an unfamiliar animal, uncertain whether it is dangerous or merely unpredictable. "Most wives of my acquaintance would prefer needlework to ledgers." "I am not most wives," Alara said. "You married a stranger out of necessity, Your Grace. You might as well discover what sort of stranger she turned out to be." That afternoon, against what she suspected was his better judgment, Gideon took her out in a modest carriage to see the tenant farms that made up the bulk of Thornfield's income. Alara had expected grandeur, or at least order. What she found instead was quiet decay, fences in need of repair, roofs patched with whatever materials could be found, children who watched the Duke's carriage pass with wary, hollow-eyed expressions rather than the curious excitement she remembered from her own childhood on her father's land. "How long has it been like this?" she asked quietly, watching a woman haul water from a well that looked as though it might collapse at any moment. "Since before my father died," Gideon said, his voice flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had trained himself not to feel the things he was describing. "He spent the estate's fortune faster than it could be replenished. Gambling, bad investments, pride disguised as ambition. By the time I inherited the title, there was very little left to inherit beyond the debts." "And you have spent every year since trying to fix what he broke," Alara said. It was not a question. Gideon did not answer, but his silence was answer enough. "Why did you never remarry sooner then?" Alara asked. "Surely there were other fortunes you might have joined with Thornfield's, long before my father's debts made me a convenient solution." His hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "Marriage requires trust," he said finally. "I have not had much reason to trust anyone in a very long time." "And yet you married me," Alara said. "Necessity is not the same as trust," Gideon said, though something in his voice suggested even he was no longer entirely certain of the distinction. They rode in silence after that, past fields that should have been thriving and were instead merely surviving, past a small stone church where Gideon's gaze lingered a moment too long on a particular corner of the graveyard before he looked away. Alara did not ask about it. She was beginning to understand that Thornfield Hall was full of wounds that had to be approached slowly, or not at all. That evening, Alara sought out Margaret in the housekeeper's small sitting room off the kitchens, hoping the older woman might be willing to share what Gideon would not. "You have questions," Margaret said, not looking up from the mending in her lap. It was not a question either. "About the portrait in the gallery," Alara said. "His Grace told me it was his sister. He asked me to turn it back to the wall, and something in the way he said it broke my heart a little, though I do not fully understand why." Margaret's needle paused. For a long moment the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire. "Lady Beatrice," she said finally. "His younger sister. She died 6 years ago, not long after their father passed and his Grace inherited the title." "How?" Alara asked gently. "There was an accident," Margaret said, her voice careful in a way that suggested she was choosing each word with great precision. "A fire in the West Wing, the part of the house that remains locked to this day. His Grace was meant to be watching her that night. He had promised their mother on her deathbed years before that he would always look after Beatrice, that nothing would ever happen to her while he had breath in his body. He fell asleep at his desk instead, exhausted from managing the estate's collapsing finances. By the time the fire was discovered, it was too late." Alara felt something cold settle in her chest. "The scar," she said quietly. "He went into the flames after her," Margaret said. "Nearly died himself. The scar you see is only the part visible above his collar. There is more beneath his clothes, though I imagine you have not yet had reason to know that." She glanced up briefly, something almost sympathetic in her weathered face. "He has never forgiven himself. Not for a single day since. That is the man you married, Your Grace. Not a monster. A man who believes himself to be one because the alternative, believing he deserves to be forgiven, feels like a betrayal of the sister he could not save." Alara sat with that knowledge long after she had left Margaret's sitting room, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by years of handling. She thought of the locked West Wing. She thought of the portrait turned to the wall, not out of shame at Beatrice's memory, but perhaps because Gideon could not bear to be looked at by eyes that could no longer look back. She thought of the pleas that had escaped him in the gallery, so raw and unguarded, so unlike the Duke the world believed him to be. She did not go to him that night. Instead, she sat by her window and watched the dark outline of the West Wing against the star-scattered sky, and something inside her, some hard, protective wall she had built on the journey to Thornfield, began, very quietly, to soften. 2 days later, an unexpected letter arrived for Alara, sealed with a crest she recognized immediately as belonging to Lord Nathaniel Price, a young nobleman who had courted her briefly before her father's debts made such a match impossible. The letter was polite on its surface, full of pleasant inquiries about her health and her new life at Thornfield, but beneath the pleasantries ran a current Alara did not like. He wrote that he had heard troubling things about the Duke of Thornfield, that her father had married her off in haste to a man known for his temper and his tragedies, that if she ever found herself unhappy in her new situation, she should remember that some doors, though closed, were never truly locked. Alara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside, uncertain what to do with the unease it stirred in her. She had not asked for Nathaniel's concern, and she resented the implication buried beneath his careful words, that she was a woman to be rescued rather than a woman capable of choosing and defending her own path. She did not mention the letter to Gideon. Not yet. But its arrival marked, though she did not know it at the time, the first thread in a web that would soon tighten around them both. That evening, Gideon found her in the library, curled into a window seat with a book she was not truly reading, her mind still occupied by Margaret's story and the letter hidden in her writing desk. "You have been quiet today," he observed, standing in the doorway as though uncertain whether he was welcome. "I have been thinking," Alara said. She set the book aside and studied him, this scarred, guarded man who carried a grief so heavy it had reshaped the entire house around it. "Margaret told me about your sister." He went very still. "I see." "I am sorry," Alara said softly, "not the sort of sorry people say out of politeness. I am truly sorry, Gideon, for what happened to her, and for what it has cost you every day since." His name, spoken without his title for the first time, seemed to catch him off guard. He crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair opposite her, though he kept a careful distance, as though closeness itself might be dangerous. "It was my fault," he said quietly. "There is no version of that story where it is not my fault. You were exhausted, working yourself into the ground trying to save an estate your father had already ruined," Alara said. "That does not sound like fault to me. That sounds like a man carrying more than any one person should have to carry alone." "You did not know her," Gideon said, his voice rough. "You do not know what was lost." "No," Alara agreed. "But I know what I see now, in the man who survived her. A man who works himself half to death to protect the people depending on him. A man who kept his sister's portrait rather than burning it or hiding it away entirely, because some part of him could not bear to lose her twice. That is not a monster, Gideon. That is someone grieving in the only way he knows how." He looked at her then, really looked, as though seeing her clearly for the first time since she had stepped down from that rain-soaked carriage. Something passed between them, fragile and unfamiliar, a thread of understanding neither of them had expected to find in a marriage built on debts and desperation. "Why do you care?" he asked. And there was genuine confusion in the question, as though the concept of someone choosing to care about him, unprompted and unpaid, was entirely foreign. "Because you are my husband," Alara said simply. "And because, whether either of us planned it this way, I find that I do not wish to spend my life married to a stranger who suffers in silence 3 rooms away from me. If we are bound together, Gideon, I would rather it mean something." The silence that followed was not the cold, empty silence of their first dinner together. It was something else entirely, warm and uncertain, the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something neither was quite ready to name. Gideon did not answer with words. He simply reached out, hesitant, as though expecting her to pull away, and rested his hand briefly over hers on the arm of the window seat. It was the smallest of gestures, and yet it felt, to Alara, like the first true beginning of their marriage, far more binding than any contract her father had signed. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet, fragile moment, the second letter that had already arrived at Thornfield that day, addressed not to Alara but to Gideon, written in a hand neither of them would recognize until it was far too late, containing words that would soon test everything beginning to grow, however cautiously, between them. The letter that had arrived for Gideon sat unopened on his desk for 2 full days before he finally broke its seal. It came from his cousin, Edmund Ashworth, a man Gideon had not spoken to in years, not since Edmund had made it clear, at their father's funeral, that he believed the title and the estate should have passed to him instead, and that Gideon, scarred and grieving and barely able to hold himself upright, was unfit to carry the Ashworth name forward. The letter was polished, careful, dripping with false concern. Edmund had heard, he wrote, that Gideon had married in haste to a woman whose family carried debts of their own. He wondered, with the sort of concern that was really a threat wearing kinder clothes, whether the marriage was entirely sound, whether certain details of the contract might be examined more closely by those with an interest in the Ashworth succession. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had friends among the barristers who handled such matters, and that he would hate for any irregularity to cause the Duchess unnecessary difficulty, should questions ever arise about the legitimacy of the union. Gideon read the letter 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass, before he finally set it down and stared out the window at the gray afternoon light falling over the grounds of Thornfield. Edmund was not merely making conversation. He was testing the ground beneath Gideon's feet, searching for a crack he could widen into a fracture, and use to pry the title away from a man he had never respected and never would. Gideon knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent years anticipating attacks from every direction, exactly what Edmund's letter truly meant. If there was any weakness in the marriage, any sign that Alara was unhappy, coerced, or regretful of the arrangement, Edmund would use it. He would drag her name through every drawing room in London, question her father's honor, question Gideon's fitness to hold his title, and in the chaos that followed, position himself as the reasonable alternative. The cousin who had always known this marriage was a mistake. The thought of Alara's name being dragged through that kind of scrutiny, of her being made to suffer for a marriage she had never wanted in the first place, settled into Gideon's chest like a stone. He had spent 6 years believing himself incapable of protecting the people he loved. He was not about to let his failure with Beatrice repeat itself with the woman who had, against every expectation he carried into their marriage, begun to matter to him more than he was prepared to admit even to himself. That evening he summoned Alara to his study, and when she arrived, curious and slightly wary at the formality of the request, he did not soften what he had decided to say. "I have been thinking," Gideon began, standing rather than sitting, as though he needed the distance of a desk between them to say what came next, "that this marriage was a mistake." Alara felt something cold drop through her stomach, though she kept her face composed. "I see," she said carefully. "May I ask what has brought about this sudden reconsideration?" "My cousin Edmund has taken an interest in the circumstances of our union," Gideon said. "He is a dangerous man, Alara, more dangerous than you understand. If he decides to make an example of this marriage, to prove it was built on nothing but debt and desperation, he will not stop at embarrassing me. He will destroy your reputation along with mine. Your father's name will be dragged through scandal alongside my own. And your solution to this is to end the marriage before he can do so," Alara said slowly, understanding now the shape of what was coming. "An annulment can be arranged quietly," Gideon said. "I have already made inquiries. It would not be difficult, given how recently we married and how little time has passed. You would be free to return to your father's house, free to marry someone else, someone without a cousin circling like a vulture, without a house full of ghosts, without a scar that frightens half the drawing rooms in London before he has even opened his mouth." "And is that what you want?" Alara asked, her voice quiet but steady, though her heart had begun to pound in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with fear. "It does not matter what I want," Gideon said. "It matters what protects you." "It matters a great deal what you want," Alara said, rising from her chair, refusing to let him retreat behind the shield of noble sacrifice. "Because I do not believe, for one moment, that you are offering me this out of concern for my reputation alone. I think you are offering it because it is easier for you to push me away than to risk losing someone else you have come to care about." Gideon's expression hardened, a wall going back up brick by brick before her eyes. "You know nothing of what I have come to care about." "Then tell me," Alara said, stepping closer, refusing to let the distance he had built with his desk and his cold, formal words stand between them. "Tell me you feel nothing, Gideon. Tell me that the moment in the gallery when you asked me, please, to turn your sister's portrait back to the wall, meant nothing to you. Tell me that the afternoon we spent riding through the tenant farms, when you spoke to me more honestly than I imagine you have spoken to anyone in years, meant nothing. Tell me, and I will walk out of this study and never raise the subject again." He did not answer. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, and Alara understood in that silence everything he refused to say aloud. "I will not accept the annulment," she said finally, her voice quiet but absolutely certain. "Not because I fear my father's reaction, and not because I am afraid of returning home in disgrace. I refuse because I do not believe, for one single moment, that this marriage is the mistake you claim it to be. I believe it is the first true thing that has happened in this house in 6 years, and I am not willing to let your cousin's threats, or your own fear of caring about someone, take that away before it has even had the chance to become what it could be." "You do not understand what you are choosing to stay for," Gideon said, his voice rough, almost pleading now, the careful control slipping. "I could not save my sister, Alara. What makes you believe I could protect you if Edmund decides to make you his target?" "Because I am not asking you to protect me from everything," Alara said gently, closing the last of the distance between them. "I am asking you to stand beside me while we face it together. That is what a marriage is supposed to be, Gideon. Not one person carrying the entire weight alone in silence, while the other waits in another room, uninformed and unwelcome. Let me help carry it. I am stronger than you seem to believe, and I am not going anywhere, no matter what threats your cousin sends by post." For a long moment, Gideon simply looked at her, and something in his rigid posture seemed to break, not outward into anger, but inward into something closer to relief, though he fought against showing it. "You said no," he said quietly, almost disbelieving. "I offered you a way out, a clean, respectable way out, and you said no." "I did," Alara said, a small, steady smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "I imagine that will not be the last time I refuse something you believe is best for me, Your Grace. You may want to grow accustomed to it." Something shifted in his face then, something that was almost, though not quite, a smile of his own, the first genuine one she had seen since her arrival at Thornfield. "You are a very difficult woman to protect, Alara Ashworth." "Good," she said. "I would hate to be easy." They stood together in the quiet study, the fire crackling low in the grate, and for the first time since the rain-soaked night of her arrival, Alara felt something in the house shift around them, as though Thornfield itself had been holding its breath for 6 long years, waiting to see whether anyone would ever choose to stay. But even as the tension in the room eased, even as Gideon allowed himself, for one brief moment, to simply look at his wife without the armor of duty and distance between them, a servant knocked hesitantly at the study door, carrying a second letter that had just arrived by urgent courier, this one addressed to both the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, sealed with Edmund Ashworth's crest, and containing a demand that would soon force them out of the quiet safety of the study, and into a battle neither of them had chosen, but both would now have to fight. Gideon broke the seal with steady hands, though Alara could see the tension returning to his shoulders as he read. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something between grim determination and quiet fear. "Edmund is coming to Thornfield," he said. "He says he wishes to pay his respects to the new Duchess, but I know my cousin, Alara. He does not travel for courtesy. He is coming to find a weakness, and he will not leave until he believes he has found one." Alara took a slow breath, steadying herself against the sudden shift in the room's quiet warmth. "Then we will simply have to make certain he finds nothing to use," she said. "Whatever comes, Gideon, we face it together. I meant what I said. I am not going anywhere." He studied her for a long moment, as though trying to memorize the shape of her certainty, storing it away against whatever storm was about to arrive at Thornfield's door. And though neither of them said it aloud, something had changed permanently in that study, a line crossed that could not be uncrossed, a beginning neither of them had expected but both, in their own guarded way, had quietly chosen. Edmund Ashworth arrived at Thornfield 3 days later, in a carriage far grander than the modest one that had once carried Alara through the storm on her wedding night. He stepped down onto the gravel with an easy, practiced smile, dressed in the height of fashion, every inch the picture of a charming gentleman, and Alara understood within moments why Gideon had warned her so seriously about him. Danger rarely announced itself with scars and silence. Sometimes it arrived smiling, with beautifully polished boots and a voice like warm honey poured over something rotten underneath. "Cousin," Edmund said, clasping Gideon's hand with a warmth that did not reach his eyes. "And this must be the new Duchess. My, Whitmore did not exaggerate when he wrote of your beauty in his letters, your grace." "You correspond with my father," Alara said, keeping her voice pleasant though something in her chest tightened at the revelation. "We share certain business interests," Edmund said smoothly. "Nothing you need concern yourself with, I am sure. A woman as lovely as you ought to concern herself only with pleasant things." Alara caught the flicker of tension in Gideon's jaw at the comment, though he said nothing, and she understood immediately that Edmund's charm was a performance, carefully calibrated to appear harmless while testing every seam in the household for weakness. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in careful conversation. Edmund complimented the wine, the estate, the improvements Gideon had made to the tenant farms, though Alara noted he phrased each compliment in a way that subtly questioned whether such improvements were affordable, given what he called, with a light laugh, the family's well-known financial difficulties. He asked Alara pointed questions about her father's estate, her dowry, the exact terms of the marriage contract, wrapped always in the appearance of polite curiosity. "You must forgive my questions," Edmund said, dabbing his mouth with a napkin after one particularly probing inquiry about the timing of the wedding. "I only ask because I care so deeply for my cousin's well-being. It would be a terrible thing, would it not, if there were any irregularity in the contract, anything that might call the marriage's legitimacy into question, and expose you both to unnecessary scandal." "There is no irregularity," Gideon said flatly, his voice carrying a warning Edmund chose to ignore. Of course," Edmund said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I only mean to help, cousin. You know how the barristers can be, always looking for loopholes, always eager to make trouble where none was intended." After dinner, while Gideon was called away briefly to deal with an urgent matter regarding one of the tenant farms, Edmund found Alara alone in the drawing room, and his mask of pleasant charm slipped, just slightly, revealing something colder underneath. "You seem a clever woman," Edmund said, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. "Cleverer than I expected given the haste of this marriage. Tell me honestly, your grace, are you happy here?" "I am," Alara said simply. "With a man who keeps his sister's portrait hidden and his own household locked away like a mausoleum," Edmund pressed, his voice dropping lower. "A man half the ton believes is cursed, who cannot enter certain rooms of his own home without his hands shaking. Surely you have noticed the West Wing remains sealed. Surely you have wondered why." "I have," Alara said, keeping her voice steady though her pulse had quickened. "And I have learned enough of the truth to understand it is not my place to discuss it with a guest at dinner." Edmund's smile thinned. "Loyal already, how touching. I wonder if that loyalty will survive once you understand the full extent of what happened here 6 years ago. My cousin is not the gentle, misunderstood soul he perhaps presents to you in quiet, private moments, Duchess. There are darker versions of that story than the one he has chosen to share." "I would be careful, Lord Edmund," Alara said, rising from her seat, her voice cool and controlled despite the anger building beneath it, "about the stories you choose to spread in a house that is not your own. I have found in my short time here that people who speak so freely about the failings of others often have failings of their own they would prefer to keep hidden." Something flashed in Edmund's eyes, quickly masked. "A warning, your grace." "Simply an observation," Alara said, and left the room before he could reply, her heart pounding, understanding now with absolute clarity exactly what kind of threat had just walked into Thornfield Hall. She found Gideon later that night in the stables, checking on a mare that had taken ill, his sleeves rolled up, his usual careful composure loosened by physical work and worry. She told him, quietly and without embellishment, exactly what Edmund had said in the drawing room, watching his face darken with each word. "He is trying to turn you against me," Gideon said, setting down the cloth he had been using to cool the mare's forehead. "Or turn you against yourself, convince you that staying here was a foolish choice, so that when he finally makes his move, you will already be halfway out the door." "It will not work," Alara said firmly. "But Gideon, I need to understand what really happened. Not because I doubt you, but because I refuse to let Edmund control the story with half-truths and threats. If there is more to tell about the night of the fire, I would rather hear it from you than have him twisted into something unrecognizable." Gideon was quiet for a long time, staring at the mare's flank rising and falling with each breath, as though gathering courage from the simple, honest rhythm of it. "There was an argument that night," he said finally, his voice low, "between Beatrice and myself. She wanted to marry a man our father would never have approved of, a man beneath her station, though I never cared much for such distinctions myself. I told her to wait, to be patient, that I would find a way to make the match acceptable once I had stabilized the estate's finances. She accused me of caring more about Thornfield's reputation than her happiness. We argued bitterly. She went to her room angry, and I went to my study to work, exhausted and frustrated, and I fell asleep at my desk instead of checking on her as I always did before retiring." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the stall door so tightly his knuckles went pale. "The fire started from a candle she had left burning while she cried herself to sleep. By the time I woke and smelled the smoke, the west wing was already engulfed. I went in after her. I found her, but I was too late. The physician said she likely never woke at all, that the smoke took her before the flames ever reached her. I have told myself that for 6 years, hoping it is true and hating myself regardless, because if I had simply gone to check on her, if I had not been so consumed by ledgers and debts and pride, she would still be alive." Alara stepped closer, gently taking his hand from the stall door, holding it between both of hers. "That is not the story of a monster, Gideon. That is the story of two people who loved each other enough to argue, and a tragedy that followed, one that was never truly your fault, no matter how many times you repeat it to yourself in the dark." "Edmund will not tell it that way," Gideon said quietly. "He will tell it as though I locked her in and let her burn out of spite over her choice of husband. He has hinted at it before in letters, in whispers among the ton. He wants the title Alara. He has wanted it since our father died, and he will use any weapon he can find to take it, including the worst night of my life, twisted into something unrecognizable." "Then we will make certain he cannot use it," Alara said, her voice steady with a resolve that surprised even her. "We will tell the truth ourselves, on our own terms, before he has the chance to poison it. Grief is not a scandal, Gideon. Only lies dressed up as scandal have power, and only if we let them." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded moving across his scarred face, gratitude and disbelief tangled together, as though he had never once considered that someone might stand beside him in this particular fight, instead of simply believing whatever version of him seemed most convenient. "Why do you fight for me like this?" he asked quietly. "You barely know me, Alara. A few weeks ago, you were a stranger stepping out of a carriage into a storm, forced into this marriage by circumstances neither of us chose." "Perhaps that is exactly why," Alara said softly. "'Cause I chose to see you clearly, without the weight of 6 years of rumors and grief clouding my judgment. And what I have seen is a man who blames himself for things that were never entirely his to carry, who protects everyone around him except himself. I am not fighting for a stranger, Gideon. I am fighting for the man who asked me, please, to turn a portrait back to the wall, because some griefs are too heavy to look at directly. That man deserves better than what Edmund intends to do to him." The mare shifted quietly in her stall, and outside the wind picked up against the stable walls, carrying with it the first cold breath of a storm that would, in more ways than one, arrive at Thornfield before the week was through. But in that moment, standing together in the lamplight, hands still joined, something had solidified between Gideon and Alara that no amount of scheming from Edmund Ashworth would easily unravel. though the true test of that bond had, in truth, only just begun. Edmund did not leave Thornfield the following morning as expected. Instead, he lingered, claiming urgent business had delayed his departure, though Alara suspected the truth was far simpler. He had not yet found the crack he had come searching for, and he was not a man inclined to leave empty-handed. Over the following days, he wove himself into the rhythm of the household with unsettling ease, charming the staff, asking careful questions of anyone willing to answer, and watching Gideon and Alara together with the patient, calculating gaze of a man building a case rather than simply visiting family. It was Margaret who first brought Alara troubling news, finding her in the small sitting room where Alara had taken to reading in the mornings, away from Edmund's constant, watchful presence. "He has been asking the younger staff questions," Margaret said quietly, closing the door behind her before speaking further. "About the fire. About whether His Grace and Lady Beatrice truly argued that night, and how loudly, and whether anyone heard him leave her door locked from the outside." Alara's blood went cold. "Locked from the outside? That is not what happened. Gideon told me himself she left a candle burning and fell asleep. There was no lock involved." "I know that," Margaret said. "Everyone in this household who was here that night knows that. But Lord Edmund is not interested in what actually happened, Your Grace. He is interested in what can be made to sound plausible enough to plant doubt. A story does not need to be true to spread. It only needs enough truth mixed into the lie to make people wonder." That evening, at dinner, Edmund raised the subject himself, with the same practiced, casual cruelty Alara had come to recognize as his particular weapon of choice. "I was speaking with some of the older tenants today," he said, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "Fascinating what people remember, given enough time and enough wine to loosen their tongues. Some of them recall quite clearly that Lady Beatrice's door was found locked that night, cousin. I wonder how such a thing might have happened if the fire truly began as innocently as you claim." The table went silent. Gideon's face had gone pale and rigid, his hand tightening around his glass with enough force that Alara feared it might shatter. "That is a lie," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous. "Is it?" Edmund said, feigning innocent surprise. "I only repeat what I have heard, cousin. Perhaps the tenants are mistaken. Memory can be unreliable, especially after 6 years. Or perhaps there are details of that night you have chosen not to share, even with your new bride." "Enough," Alara said sharply, before Gideon could respond, drawing Edmund's attention toward her instead. "I have heard quite enough, Lord Edmund, of your careful little insinuations dressed up as concern. If you have an accusation to make it plainly, so that it can be answered plainly. But do not sit at this table pretending to repeat innocent gossip while attempting to plant poison in its place. I see exactly what you are doing, even if you believe the rest of this household does not." Edmund's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "You are quite protective of your husband, Duchess, for a woman married to him only weeks ago. I wonder what he has told you to earn such fierce loyalty so quickly." "He has told me the truth," Alara said, "which is more than I believe you are capable of offering anyone, including yourself." The dinner ended in tense silence shortly after, Edmund retreating to his rooms with an expression that suggested the evening had not gone entirely as he planned, though Alara took no comfort in the small victory. She understood with growing dread that a man like Edmund did not simply give up after one setback. He regrouped. He found new angles, and the fact that he had begun spreading whispers among the tenants meant his campaign against Gideon had already moved beyond the walls of Thornfield, into the wider world where reputations could be destroyed by rumor alone, regardless of truth. Gideon found her later that night in the gallery, standing once again in front of Beatrice's turned portrait, though this time she did not reach to turn it around. She simply stood, thinking, trying to piece together a plan that might counter whatever Edmund intended next. "You should not have spoken to him that way at dinner," Gideon said, though his voice lacked real reproach. "Edmund is not a man who forgives being challenged publicly. You have made yourself a target now, alongside me." I was already a target the moment I married you, Alara said. I would rather be a target who fights back than one who sits quietly, hoping the storm passes over her untouched. That has never been my nature, Gideon, and I do not intend to change it now, especially not to make Edmund's cruelty more comfortable. Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. I am afraid, he admitted finally, the words clearly costing him something significant to say aloud. Not of Edmund himself. I have weathered his schemes before, and I imagine I will weather them again. I am afraid of what it will cost you, Alara, to stand beside me while he does it. He destroyed my confidence once long ago, convinced our father I was unfit to inherit before Beatrice's death ever happened. He is patient, and he is thorough, and he does not care who gets hurt so long as he eventually gets what he wants. Then we will simply have to be more patient and more thorough, Alara said. I am not asking you to protect me from this, Gideon. I told you before, I am asking you to let me stand beside you while we face it together. If you push me away now, out of fear for what it might cost me, you will only be proving Edmund's version of events correct, that this marriage was never strong enough to survive real difficulty. I refuse to let that happen. Do you understand me? Something in Gideon's guarded expression cracked, just slightly, and for a moment he looked less like the cold Duke the Ton whispered about and more like a man simply exhausted from carrying too much weight alone for too many years. I do not deserve you, he said quietly. I do not know what I did in this life or any other to be given a wife who fights for me instead of fleeing at the first sign of difficulty. You have done nothing to deserve or not deserve me, Gideon, Alara said gently, closing the distance between them. I am simply choosing to stay and to fight because I believe you are worth fighting for, whatever Edmund says, whatever the rest of the Ton whispers behind their fans. That is not a debt to be repaid. It is simply a choice made freely, and I intend to keep making it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the evening settling around them in the quiet gallery, Beatrice's turned portrait a silent witness to whatever was slowly, carefully, growing between them despite every obstacle placed in its path. But the fragile peace of that moment did not last. 3 days later, a scandal sheet arrived at Thornfield, delivered by an anxious young footman who clearly understood the danger of the contents before he had even finished handing it to Margaret. The publication, widely read among London's fashionable circles, contained a story that made Alara's stomach drop the moment she read the first line. The article spoke of the Duke of Thornfield in thinly veiled terms, referring to him only as a nobleman known for his scars and his silence, whose younger sister had perished under circumstances the piece described as troubling and insufficiently explained. It hinted, without ever stating outright, that questions remained about the true nature of the fire, and suggested that the Duke's hasty new marriage, to a woman whose family carried substantial debts, might have been arranged to quiet rumors rather than out of any genuine affection. Alara read the piece twice, her hands trembling with anger rather than fear, before carrying it directly to Gideon's study. Edmund, Gideon said flatly, after reading only the first paragraph, his voice cold with a fury Alara had not yet seen from him. This has his fingerprints all over it. He knows every editor in London who owes him favors. Then we answer it, Alara said firmly, publicly and on our own terms before this spreads any further and takes root as accepted truth. How? Gideon asked, his frustration evident. I cannot simply write to a scandal sheet and demand they print a retraction. That would only draw more attention to the story, not less. Not a retraction, Alara said, an idea forming quickly as she spoke. A different kind of story entirely. We host an event here at Thornfield and invite members of the Ton to see for themselves what kind of household we actually run. We show them the improvements made to the tenant farms, the genuine warmth between us, the truth of who you are, rather than the shadow Edmund has painted. Let them see with their own eyes, rather than relying on whispers printed by men who have never set foot on this estate. Gideon stared at her for a long moment, something like admiration slowly replacing the anger in his expression. You want to invite the very people spreading rumors about us into our home. I want to take away Edmund's ability to control the story, Alara said. Rumors thrive in absence, Gideon. They wither when confronted with reality. If we hide, we confirm every suspicion Edmund plants. If we open our doors and show them exactly who we are, we take that weapon away from him entirely. It was, Gideon admitted slowly, a bold plan and a dangerous one, requiring him to open Thornfield and by extension himself, to the very scrutiny he had spent 6 years avoiding. But as he looked at his wife, standing before him with fierce determination in her eyes, refusing to be cowed by scandal or threat, he found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, willing to take the risk. "Very well," he said finally. "We will host the gathering, but Alara, I need you to understand something first before we walk further into this fight together." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "Edmund will not stop with rumors if this plan succeeds in undermining him. A man like my cousin, cornered and humiliated, becomes more dangerous, not less. I need you to promise me you will be careful. Whatever happens next, I could not bear it if my own stubbornness cost you your safety, the way my exhaustion once cost Beatrice hers." "I promise to be careful," Alara said softly. "But I will not promise to hide, Gideon, not from Edmund and not from whatever comes next. We face this together, remember. That includes the danger, not only the comfortable parts." He nodded slowly, though the worry did not entirely leave his face, and together they began planning the gathering that would either save their reputation, or, if Edmund had his way, become the very battlefield on which everything they were building might finally collapse. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of preparation. Alara threw herself into the work with an energy that seemed to breathe new life into Thornfield Hall itself. Rooms long closed off were aired and cleaned. Margaret, delighted to finally have a purpose beyond simple maintenance, directed the staff with renewed vigor. Even Arthur, the old groundskeeper, seemed to walk a little straighter as he tended the gardens in preparation for guests who would, for the first time in years, actually see them. Gideon watched the transformation with a mixture of gratitude and unease. He had spent 6 years keeping the world at a careful distance, and now his wife was flinging open the doors, inviting the very people whose judgment he feared most to walk through them. Yet he could not deny that something in the house felt different, lighter, as though Thornfield itself had been waiting for someone brave enough to stop treating it like a tomb. Edmund, for his part, watched the preparations with narrowed eyes, his charming mask slipping more frequently as the day of the gathering approached. He had expected Gideon to retreat further into isolation under the pressure of the scandal sheet's insinuations. Instead, the Duke and Duchess seemed to be growing stronger, more united, and Alara did not miss the flicker of genuine alarm that crossed Edmund's face whenever he observed them together, speaking easily, working as partners rather than strangers bound by contract. 3 nights before the gathering, disaster nearly struck in a form no one had anticipated. Alara had gone down to the stables late in the evening to check on the mare that had been ill weeks before, now fully recovered, but still favored by Alara during her nightly walks around the grounds. She did not notice, in the darkness, that one of the stable lanterns had been left burning too close to a pile of dry hay near the tack room, nor did she notice, until the smell of smoke reached her, that the small fire had already begun to spread. Her scream brought stable hands running, and within minutes, buckets of water were being passed hand to hand in a desperate chain, but the fire had caught quickly in the dry summer hay, and smoke filled the stable with alarming speed. Alara, refusing to simply stand back while horses screamed in their stalls, ran forward to help unlatch the doors, coughing against the thickening smoke, when a support beam above her, weakened by the flames, groaned and began to give way. She never saw Gideon arrive. One moment she was reaching for the latch of a terrified horse's stall, and the next, powerful arms were around her, pulling her backward with such force that she stumbled and fell against his chest, just as the beam crashed down exactly where she had been standing, sending up a shower of sparks and splintered wood. "Alara," Gideon's voice was raw, stripped of every careful, controlled as she had come to know, pure terror bleeding through every syllable. He pulled her further back from the flames, his hands moving over her frantically, checking for injury, for burns, for anything that might explain the way his entire body was shaking. "Are you hurt? Alara, look at me, are you hurt?" "I am fine," she managed, coughing, her eyes streaming from the smoke. "Gideon, the horses." "Let the stable hands manage the horses," he said, though his voice cracked on the words, and he did not release his grip on her, as though letting go might cause her to vanish entirely. He half carried, half guided her further from the burning building, not stopping until they were well clear of the smoke. And then, in full view of the gathering staff and the arriving Edmund, who had come running from the house at the sound of the commotion, Gideon simply held her, his face buried against her hair, his shoulders shaking with something that was not quite composure. The fire was eventually contained, the damage limited to one section of the stable, no horses lost, though the tack room and a good portion of stored hay were destroyed. It was not until much later that night, after the last embers had been doused and the exhausted staff sent to rest, that Gideon and Alara found themselves alone in the drawing room, both still smelling of smoke, both shaken in ways that went far deeper than singed clothing. Gideon sat across from her, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had gone white, staring at the floor as though he could not quite bring himself to look at her directly. "I could have lost you tonight," he said quietly, the words seeming to cost him enormous effort. "The way I lost Beatrice. I was in my study again, Alara, working through Edmund's latest threats, and if the stable hand had not come running to fetch me, if I had been even a few minutes slower." "But you were not slower," Alara said gently, moving to sit beside him, placing her hand over his clenched fists until slowly his fingers loosened enough to hold hers in return. "You came, Gideon. You pulled me back before that beam ever touched me. That is not the same story as before. That is an entirely different ending." "I do not think I could survive losing you," Gideon said, and something in his voice, raw and unguarded and utterly without its usual careful control, made Alara go very still, understanding that he was saying something far larger than simple relief at her survival. "I have spent 6 years telling myself I was incapable of caring about anyone deeply enough to be devastated by their loss again. It seemed safer that way. Smaller. If I never let myself feel that much for another person, I could never be broken by losing them the way I was broken by losing Beatrice." He finally looked up at her, and what Alara saw in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs, a raw vulnerability so complete it seemed to strip away every wall he had ever built. "Tonight, watching that beam fall toward you, I understood with absolute horror that I had failed completely at staying safe. I have fallen in love with you, Alara. Somewhere between the storm on the night you arrived, and the gallery and the stables tonight, I fell in love with my own wife, and I do not know how to carry that without being terrified I will fail you the way I failed her." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous all at once. Alara felt her own eyes fill with tears, though she blinked them back, wanting to see him clearly in this moment that had taken so long and cost them both so much fear to finally arrive. "You will not fail me, Gideon," she said softly, reaching up to touch the scarred side of his face, the touch he flinched from instinctively before allowing himself slowly to lean into it instead. "Loving someone does not mean you will never lose them or never be afraid for them. It means choosing, every single day, to stand beside them anyway, to fight for them, to pull them back from falling beams when the moment demands it. You have already proven, tonight and every day since I arrived, exactly the kind of man you are. Not the beast the ton whispers about. A man capable of enormous love, who has simply been too afraid to let himself feel it fully, until tonight forced the truth out of him." "I love you," Gideon said again, as though testing the words, as though saying them once had cracked something open that could not now be closed. "I love you, Alara, and I am terrified by how completely that is true." "I love you too," Alara said, and the smile that broke across her face, despite the smoke still clinging to her hair and the exhaustion in her bones, was the first truly unguarded smile Thornfield Hall had witnessed in 6 long years. "I have, I think, for longer than I have been willing to admit to myself. Perhaps since the moment you asked me, please, to turn Beatrice's portrait back to the wall, and I understood exactly how much you were still capable of feeling, buried beneath all that careful, protective silence. Gideon reached out then and pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time since her arrival, Thornfield Hall did not feel like a house holding its breath around an old wound. It felt instead like a house finally beginning to heal, one honest confession at a time. But even as they held each other in the quiet drawing room, neither of them noticed the shadow that had lingered near the doorway moments before, retreating silently down the corridor. Edmund had heard every word, and the fury on his face, twisted and calculating in the dim candlelight, promised that the fire in the stables had been only the beginning of the danger he intended to bring down upon them both. The morning of the gathering arrived clear and bright, an unseasonably warm sun burning off the last traces of mist over Thornfield's grounds, as though the estate itself understood the significance of the day ahead. Carriages began arriving by mid-afternoon, filled with members of the ton eager to see, with their own eyes, the household that had recently become the subject of such fascinating gossip. Alara greeted each guest with warm, practiced grace, while Gideon, though visibly uncomfortable with the attention, stood beside her, no longer retreating to his study at the first sign of difficulty. Edmund arrived among the guests, his charming mask fully restored, though Alara noticed the careful, calculating way his eyes moved over the crowd, searching for his opening. She had not told Gideon what she suspected, that Edmund had overheard their confession in the drawing room, but she felt it in her bones, a quiet certainty that the coming hours would bring more than polite conversation and afternoon tea. The gathering proceeded well at first. Guests toured the improved tenant farms Alara had insisted on including in the day's itinerary, expressing genuine surprise at the thoughtful management they witnessed, so different from the neglect the scandal sheets had implied. They admired the newly aired rooms of the house, the warmth between the Duke and Duchess as they moved through the crowd together, answering questions honestly rather than hiding behind evasive politeness. Slowly, visibly, the narrative Edmund had worked so hard to construct began to crumble under the simple weight of reality. It was during the evening's dinner, held in the grand dining hall now filled with lively conversation instead of oppressive silence, that Edmund made his move. He rose from his seat partway through the meal, tapping his glass for attention with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I find myself so moved by tonight's warmth," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room, "that I feel compelled to share something with our esteemed guests. A story, if you will, about the true events of the fire that claimed my cousin's dear sister 6 years ago. I believe the Duchess, and indeed all of you, deserve to know the full truth, rather than the carefully edited version my cousin has no doubt shared." The room went utterly silent. Alara felt her heart drop, and beside her she felt Gideon go rigid, every muscle in his body coiling with the tension of a man bracing for a blow he had spent 6 years dreading. "Edmund," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous, "this is neither the time nor the place." "On the contrary, cousin," Edmund said, his smile widening into something closer to a sneer, "I believe this is exactly the time and place. These good people came to judge for themselves whether you are truly the man your reputation suggests, or something far more sympathetic. They deserve the complete picture, do they not?" Before Gideon could respond, before the tension in the room could fully erupt into chaos, Alara rose from her seat, her voice calm and clear enough to carry over Edmund's without shouting. "I agree entirely," she said, drawing every eye in the room toward her instead. "In fact, Lord Edmund has saved me the trouble of raising the subject myself. 6 years ago, my husband lost his beloved sister, Lady Beatrice, in a tragic accident that has haunted him every single day since. He blames himself, though the truth is simply that exhaustion, grief over their father's recent passing, and the desperate work of saving this estate from ruin left him unable to reach her in time. That is not scandal, my lords and ladies, that is grief. That is a man who has spent 6 years punishing himself for a tragedy he did not cause, working tirelessly to protect the very people who depend on this estate, including tenants whose lives have measurably improved under his care, as many of you witnessed yourselves this very afternoon. She turned to look directly at Edmund, her voice hardening. "What troubles me far more than any honest grief, Lord Edmund, is a man who would use his own cousin's deepest tragedy as a weapon, spreading half-truths through scandal sheets and paid rumors among tenants, all in pursuit of a title he was never meant to inherit. I wonder what the assembled company would think, if they knew the full extent of your campaign against a grieving man, simply because he happened to survive when you believed you deserved his position more." Murmurs rippled through the room, guests exchanging glances, and Alara watched with quiet satisfaction as the narrative shifted visibly before her eyes, sympathy moving away from Edmund's carefully constructed insinuations and toward the raw, honest vulnerability she had just laid bare. Edmund's composure finally cracked. "You dare accuse me, in front of witnesses, of such things without a shred of proof." "I have letters, Lord Edmund," Alara said, her voice steady despite the danger of the bluff she was about to attempt, praying silently that her instincts about his methods were correct. "Correspondence that suggests a rather organized campaign to plant doubt about my husband's fitness for his title. Should you wish to continue this conversation, I would be happy to discuss the specifics privately, though I suspect you would prefer that particular discussion remain far from public ears." It was not entirely true, not yet, though Alara had already instructed a discreet solicitor to begin gathering exactly such evidence, certain that a man as thorough as Edmund would have left some trail behind him. But the mere suggestion, delivered with such calm certainty, was enough. Edmund's face went pale, his earlier confidence collapsing into something far more uncertain, and after a long, tense moment, he offered a stiff, shallow bow. "I believe I have overstayed my welcome," he said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "I will take my leave." He departed within the hour, and though the gathering continued with a slightly awkward undercurrent for some time afterward, the guests who remained left Thornfield that night with a story entirely different from the one Edmund had hoped to plant. They spoke in the weeks that followed not of scandal and suspicious fires, but of a devoted duchess who had defended her husband with fierce, unwavering loyalty, and a duke whose grief, once understood, earned sympathy rather than suspicion. Later that night, after the last carriage had departed and Thornfield had settled into welcome quiet, Gideon found Alara in the gallery once more, standing before Beatrice's portrait, though this time, without hesitation, she reached out and turned it to face the room fully. "I thought," she said softly, as Gideon approached, "that perhaps it was time she was allowed to be seen again. Not hidden away like a shameful secret, but remembered as she deserves to be, by a house finally ready to hold both grief and joy together, rather than choosing only one." Gideon stood beside her, looking at his sister's painted face for the first time in years without immediately looking away. "She would have liked you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said I would marry someone who could see past my scars, if I ever let myself be brave enough to try." "Then perhaps," Alara said, slipping her hand into his, "we owe her a debt of gratitude for being right." They stood together in the gallery for a long while, the portrait no longer a wound hidden from view, but a quiet, gentle presence watching over the beginning of something neither of them had expected, but both had come, fully and without reservation, to choose. Yet even as peace settled over Thornfield that night, neither of them could know that Edmund, humiliated and desperate, had already begun plotting one final, dangerous move, one that would force the truth of their love to its ultimate test. 2 weeks passed in a quiet, healing calm after the gathering, and Thornfield Hall seemed, day by day, to shed the last of its heavy silence. Alara continued her work with the tenant farms, arranging for repairs and fair wages that Gideon, now fully invested in her judgment as well as his own, approved without hesitation. Margaret hummed while she worked. Even Arthur, the old groundskeeper, had begun teaching a young stable hand the finer points of managing the orchards, his limp seeming, if not cured, then at least less burdensome to carry. Gideon and Alara had settled into a rhythm neither had expected from a marriage born of debt and desperation, mornings spent together over breakfast, afternoons touring the estate side by side, evenings in the library where Gideon had finally begun to laugh, quietly at first, then more freely, a sound Alara treasured more than she could have imagined possible only weeks before. It was Alara's solicitor, a careful and thorough man named William Hartley, who first uncovered the full extent of Edmund's scheming. Letters, carefully preserved, revealed a pattern stretching back years. Payments made to editors at the scandal sheets, bribes offered to tenants for damaging testimony, even correspondence with a corrupt barrister discussing methods to challenge the legitimacy of Gideon's inheritance through fabricated evidence about the night of the fire. It was, Hartley confirmed grimly, more than enough to have Edmund brought before a magistrate on charges of fraud and slander, should Gideon choose to pursue it. Gideon read through the evidence with a heavy heart, not out of any lingering affection for his cousin, but out of exhaustion at the thought of dragging the family name through yet another public battle, however justified. Alara found him in his study late one evening, the papers spread across his desk, his expression troubled. "You are considering letting him go unpunished," she said gently, taking the seat across from him. "I am considering the cost of pursuing this," Gideon admitted. A public trial would drag Beatrice's memory through the mud all over again, in far greater detail than anything Edmund managed at the gathering. I am not certain I have the strength to relive that, even to see him properly punished. "Then we do not need a public trial," Alara said thoughtfully. "We simply need Edmund to understand that we hold enough evidence to ruin him utterly, and that his only path forward is quiet, permanent retreat from any further schemes against this family. Men like your cousin value their comfort and reputation above almost everything else, Gideon. Threaten those, privately and decisively, and I suspect he will choose silence over exposure." It was, in the end, exactly what happened. Gideon summoned Edmund to a private meeting in London, accompanied by Hartley and the full weight of the evidence they had gathered. Whatever was said in that meeting, Gideon never fully shared the details with Alara, only that Edmund had left pale and shaken, and that within a month word arrived that he had quietly relocated to the continent. His schemes against Thornfield finally, thoroughly, ended. With that threat lifted, a lightness settled over the household that Alara had not thought possible when she first arrived, soaked and frightened, into a house that had felt more like a fortress than a home. She found Gideon one crisp autumn morning in the gallery, standing before Beatrice's portrait, a small, thoughtful smile on his face, rather than the guarded grief she had grown accustomed to seeing there. "I have been thinking," he said, turning to face her as she entered, "about the day you arrived here." "A rather unpleasant memory, I imagine," Alara said, smiling despite herself. "Storms and cold silences are not the stuff of romantic beginnings." "On the contrary," Gideon said, taking her hands in his, "I think of it often, actually. The moment you refused to walk into this house until you were ready. I had never, in my entire life, met anyone who dared to defy me so completely, and so calmly. I think, if I am honest, that I fell a little in love with you that very first night, though it took me far longer than I would like to admit to recognize what I was feeling." Alara felt her breath catch, something warm blooming in her chest at his words. "You told me, in the drawing room after the fire, that you loved me. I did not think there was more to say beyond that." "There is one more thing," Gideon said, and to her astonishment he lowered himself onto one knee before her, right there in the gallery, beneath his sister's watchful painted eyes. "When we married, it was a contract, arranged by our fathers, built on necessity rather than choice. You never truly chose me, Alara, not freely, not in the way a woman should be allowed to choose the man she marries. I would like to correct that, if you will permit me." He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, simple but beautifully crafted, entirely unlike the grand, formal jewelry that had accompanied their original wedding contract. "Alara Whitmore Ashworth, I am asking you now freely, without contracts or debts or family obligations standing between us, to choose to be my wife. Not because your father required it, and not because mine did either, but because I love you more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone, and I would be endlessly grateful if you chose to stay by my side, not out of duty, but out of desire." Tears filled Alara's eyes, and she found herself laughing softly through them, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment, so different from the cold, formal beginning they had once shared. "You already know my answer, Gideon Ashworth," she said. "I gave it to you weeks ago when I refused the annulment you tried to offer me. I choose you. I have chosen you every single day since that stormy night, and I intend to keep choosing you for every day that follows." "Say it again," Gideon said softly, still on one knee, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Properly this time as an answer to an actual proposal freely given." "Yes," Alara said, laughing and crying at once as he rose and pulled her into his arms. "Yes, Gideon. 1,000 times, yes." They were married again 3 weeks later, not in a hurried, formal ceremony arranged to settle debts, but in a joyful celebration held in the newly restored chapel on Thornfield's grounds, attended by tenants whose lives had genuinely improved under their care, by Margaret, beaming with unabashed pride, by Arthur and Clara, and every member of the household who had watched, over the preceding months, a house of silence and grief slowly transform into a home filled with laughter and warmth. Beatrice's portrait, moved from the gallery at Alara's gentle suggestion, hung now in the newly restored drawing room, no longer a hidden wound but a cherished presence, watching over family gatherings and quiet evenings with a painted smile that seemed, somehow, lighter than it had before, as though she too approved of the love that had finally been allowed to bloom within these once cold walls. Standing at the altar that day, looking at the woman who had refused to be turned away by his coldness, who had said no to the safety of distance and yes to the difficult, uncertain work of loving a broken man back toward wholeness, Gideon Ashworth understood, with a clarity that no longer frightened him, exactly what he had found. Not merely a wife, arranged by contract and necessity, but a partner who had walked willingly into the storm of his grief and chosen, again and again, to stay. "I love you," he whispered, as their vows concluded and the small gathered crowd erupted into warm applause. "I love you too," Alara whispered back, smiling up at the man who had once been called a beast by everyone who never bothered to look past his scars, and who she now knew, more completely than anyone else in the world, to be nothing less than the truest, most devoted heart she had ever encountered. Thornfield Hall, once a house that held its breath around old wounds, finally exhaled, filled at last with the sound of laughter and love, and the quiet, steady promise of everything still to come. A year after the wedding, a rider arrived at Thornfield's gates at a dangerous gallop, his horse lathered white with sweat, shouting for the Duke before he had even reached the courtyard. Gideon met him at the door himself, Alara close behind, her hand instinctively resting over the small, rounding curve of her stomach, 6 months along with their first child. "Your Grace," the rider gasped, nearly falling from his saddle in exhaustion. "There has been a landslide on the northern road near the tenant villages. Several families are trapped, the road blocked by fallen earth and timber. Water is rising fast from the swollen river beside it." Gideon did not hesitate. Within minutes, he had gathered every able hand on the estate, organizing ropes, carts, and shovels with the same calm efficiency that had, over the past year, turned Thornfield from a struggling estate into one of the most respected in the region. Alara moved to join the preparations, only for Gideon to catch her arm gently. "Not this time," he said, his eyes soft but firm. "You are carrying our child, Alara. I need you safe here, coordinating supplies and shelter for whoever we bring back. That is not a lesser task. It may well be the more important one." She wanted to argue, old habits of stubborn independence rising quickly to her tongue, but she saw the genuine fear beneath his calm request, the memory of loss still living quietly within him even after a year of healing, and she nodded instead. "Bring them home safely," she said. "All of them, including yourself." The rescue took the better part of a terrifying night. Alara organized blankets, food, and makeshift beds in the Great Hall, directing Margaret and the household staff with a steady authority that had, over the past year, earned her the genuine respect and affection of everyone at Thornfield. Word trickled in slowly through exhausted messengers, families pulled free from the mud, a young boy rescued from a collapsed shed just before the rising water reached it, An elderly woman carried on Gideon's own back for nearly a mile of treacherous, unstable ground. It was nearly dawn when Gideon finally returned, mud-streaked and exhausted but whole, leading the last of the rescued families into the warm, lit hall where Alara waited. She ran to him without hesitation, careful of her rounded stomach, but unwilling to wait a moment longer to confirm with her own eyes that he had truly returned unharmed. "Everyone is accounted for," Gideon said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion as he held her close. "Every single family. No one lost." "You are extraordinary," Alara whispered against his chest, feeling the exhausted tremble of muscles that had spent all night pulling survivors from danger. "We are extraordinary," Gideon corrected gently, pulling back just enough to look at her, at the life growing between them, at the household filled with grateful, safe families who had, only hours before, feared they would lose everything. "None of this would have happened without you organizing every detail while I was away. You saved as many lives tonight as I did, Alara. Do not diminish your own part in it." In the weeks that followed, the story of the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield's tireless rescue efforts spread throughout the county, further cementing the reputation Alara had worked so carefully to rebuild after Edmund's scheming. It was during this time of renewed goodwill that an unexpected visitor arrived, one whose presence stirred old, uncomfortable memories. Nathaniel Price, the nobleman who had once courted Alara before her father's debts made such a match impossible, arrived at Thornfield's gates under the guise of offering assistance to the flood-affected families, though Alara suspected, from the moment she saw him, that his true motive ran deeper. He found her alone in the garden one afternoon, tending to a small patch of flowers she had planted herself, a habit Gideon had once found strange but now understood as her particular way of putting down roots in a house that had once felt like anything but home. "You look well, Alara," Nathaniel said, his tone carrying the same careful concern that had colored his letter over a year before. "Motherhood suits you already, it seems, even before your child has arrived." "Thank you, Lord Nathaniel," Alara said politely, though something in his manner put her instantly on guard. "I did not expect to see you at Thornfield." "I heard of the flooding," he said, "and of the Duke's rather heroic rescue efforts. I confess I also heard whispers, some months ago, of difficulties within your marriage, a cousin scheming against the succession, scandal sheets full of troubling insinuations. I worried for you, truly. I still believe, Alara, that you deserved a gentler beginning than the one circumstances forced upon you." "I appreciate your concern," Alara said carefully, "though I assure you it is unnecessary. Whatever difficulties we faced have long since been resolved, and I have never been happier or more secure than I am now, in this marriage you seem so determined to worry over." "Are you certain?" Nathaniel pressed, stepping closer, his voice dropping lower. "A man like the Duke, marked so visibly by tragedy, carries burdens that do not simply vanish because a house has been reopened and a few tenants rescued from a flood. I only wish to ensure you are not settling for comfort disguised as happiness, Alara. You deserve more than merely surviving a difficult marriage." Alara set down her gardening tools and studied him for a long moment, understanding now fully the persistent misunderstanding at the heart of his concern. "Lord Nathaniel," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I am not surviving my marriage. I am thriving within it precisely because my husband is a man capable of enormous depth and enormous love, qualities I have come to treasure far more than the comfortable, uncomplicated courtship you once offered me. I did not marry a burden to be endured. I married a man I love completely, and who loves me in return with a devotion I have never once doubted, not even during our most difficult days." Nathaniel's expression shifted, disappointment mixed with something like grudging respect. "I see," he said quietly. "I apologize if my concern has overstepped, Alara. I only ever wished for your happiness." "Then you may rest easy," Alara said, softening slightly, unwilling to be unkind to a man whose intentions, however misguided, had never been malicious. "I have found it, fully and completely, exactly where I once feared I never would." Nathaniel departed Thornfield that same afternoon, and though he wrote occasionally over the following years, always with the same careful, distant politeness. He never again suggested that Alara's happiness might exist somewhere other than within the marriage she had chosen, and continued choosing, every single day. That evening, Alara told Gideon about the conversation, watching carefully for any flicker of the old insecurity that might once have shadowed his expression. Instead, he simply listened, and when she finished, he pulled her gently into his arms, resting a hand over the curve where their child grew steadily toward the world. "You did not need to defend our marriage to him," Gideon said softly. "Though I confess, I am glad you did, if only because I imagine it settled things rather thoroughly." "I did not defend it for his benefit," Alara said, smiling up at him. "I defended it because it is true, and because saying it aloud to someone who once believed he understood what I deserved better than I did myself felt like a fitting way to close that particular chapter of my life completely." Their daughter was born on a mild spring morning some months later, healthy and loud-voiced, with her mother's fierce, determined eyes, and as she grew, an unmistakable stubbornness that made the household staff laugh and remark fondly that Thornfield had gained a second duchess in miniature. They named her Beatrice, after the aunt she would never meet but whose portrait watched over her nursery with a gentle, painted smile, as though finally, after so many years of silent grief, she had been given something joyful to witness. Thornfield Hall, once a house defined by locked doors and hidden portraits, became instead a home known throughout the county for its warmth, its fair treatment of tenants, and the deep, visible devotion between its duke and duchess. A love story that had begun in a rainstorm with a single, defiant refusal, and had grown, through fire and scandal and quiet, patient courage, into something neither of them had ever quite dared to hope for. And both of them now understood they would spend the rest of their lives grateful to have found.